Welcome to my video on building your How to Fly an Airplane book. The name is a bit tongue-in-cheek, so I'll admit to that and I'll explain a little later on where it came from. So one question you might ask is, so what? So you put your checklists into a book, maybe you threw a few other things into it, and why would I want to sit through a video on how to do that? It all seems pretty obvious. This is an exercise I encourage my students to do, and it has quite a lot of value, particularly during your training periods and when you're seeking a new rating, like your instrument rating. In this video, I want to discuss the value of building such a book, how I developed mine, and how I use it, and why I strongly encourage my students to go through that exercise. Let me spend a moment on brief history of where the book comes from. During my Navy flying days, I did a lot of functional test flying, and these flights were mostly scripted, and there was a lot of data that I needed to have readily available. Now, we had kneeboard-sized books that we could use for this purpose, but they were not very efficient, and so one day I went down to Supply and pulled out one of those checklist books, and I tailor-made my own functional check flying procedures in a book. And I found it to be extremely useful. It worked quite well during these high-intensity, busy functional test flights. Later, when I got back into flight instruction, I pulled out that old book and I stuffed it full of very useful information, procedures about how to do various maneuvers, local areas, all the VORs in the area, all of the airports and their frequencies and things like that. And I kept that handy and found it quite useful. Later, I got into a partnership in a 182 and did the same thing. I went through the POH and pulled out all the relevant information while I was flying the 182. One day I was flying some friends in the local area, and I left my book in the car, and I asked my wife to get my How to Fly an Airplane book, thinking it would have an effect with the passengers, and it certainly did. And ever since then, I've called this booklet my How to Fly an Airplane book, and it generally gets a chuckle, at least for the first time I use it. I think everyone should build one of these books. I've known experienced pilots, mostly military pilots actually, who religiously keep one of these things in their flight bag and refer to it often. It's also very helpful for flight instructors, as I said before. It's a good place to codify the procedures and perhaps keep a store of figures that you might want to show your students. It doesn't have to be in a book either. It can be on your iPad, but I personally like paper. So let's get into some of the reasons why and the how-tos of this thing. When I start a new student, I generally spend a few minutes showing them my book and encouraging them to build one of their own in whatever format they choose. In my opinion, this is a great way to study. There's probably no better way to learn material, try to restate what you've learned into a different form, and trying to do that in a succinct form even sharpens that skill more. It also helps to refresh your memory if you're going to take a check ride, and it may be used as a reference for the check ride act. So it's a good thing to have. For experienced pilots, this allows you to tailor your checklist and other information to the specific airplane, that is the specific tail number that you're flying. It's a great way to learn a new aircraft. It's particularly valuable to have a set of avionics, what I call cheat sheets. Some of this avionics can be fairly complicated, and often some of the functions that you'd like to use are not used very often. And how did I set up the squelch on that thing 6 months ago? You tend to not remember that. And lastly, if it's done right, it'll be a permanent reference, and it'll continue to grow as you continue to fly. So to finish the introduction, I just want to say that the book is a personalized, and I emphasize the word personalized, summary of information that every pilot should know or should have handy. It could be a physical book or it could be your iPad, as I said before. It's a great way to learn a new airplane or new procedures or anything else that you might need. And it's a good quick reference. And as I said before, you could take it with you on your check ride. You can make it in formats, whichever makes sense to you, and it's shareable. So I can imagine situations in a flight school, for instance, where someone might make an avionics cheat sheet for a particular item, say it's a fuel totalizer, and then share them with the other people that are training in that same airplane. It could be very useful to pass these around. Well, let's take a look at the book itself. There's really not much to it. Here's a picture of my book. There's also a second size, the larger 5.5 by 8.5, which I think is a little bit too large. I like the smaller version. It's 5.25 by 7.25, I think is the right numbers. It's just a very convenient size. On the other end, you could get something very inexpensive. You can go to a stationery store and buy some half-sheet protectors and some of these snap rings. And for very little money, probably less than $10, you're in business. Find some kind of plastic you can put on, use for the covers, and you're good to go. And it's not going to cost you very much at all. Now, I definitely would not recommend anything larger than these that we talked about. I definitely think that an 8.5 by 11 regular notebook is really too big and too clumsy. I've had a couple of students try it, and it doesn't work very well. Well, lastly, an awful lot of people fly with iPads or their iPhone. If that's the way you like to fly, then putting your How to Fly an Airplane book on that platform is probably a very good choice. That has the added advantage that you could keep, for instance, the book on your iPhone and your approach plates on the iPad. So it'll all work out pretty nicely for you. Pick one of these techniques, shop around the internet, go to a stationery store, and just get something that works. You can always change it later. Well, let's get into examples of specific pages that you might put into your book. And I emphasize these are examples. I encourage people to come up with their own formats, their own style. There's a bunch of different types of pages, and I'll get into each one of these separately, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this particular chart. The first type of checklist page that's probably the most obvious are your checklists. So most of you have had the experience of getting into an airplane. Perhaps it's a rental. You reach into the side pocket and you pull out a plastic card, perhaps produced by a third party, that is supposed to be a checklist for your airplane. And yet you'll find that the checklist is totally unrepresentative of the particular airplane. There's equipment in that airplane that are not addressed in the checklists, and there are items on the checklists that are not in the airplane. And so how valuable is that, really? I mean, should they not be representative of the airplane? Another area is the specific situation or the specific condition of your flight. For example, when I start a new instrument student, I have a kneeboard card that has various checklist points that should be incorporated into your pre-start, taxi, takeoff, all those kinds of phases of flight, and they address specific points that should be dealt with if you're on an instrument flight plan. And so incorporating those into the normal flow of a checklist would be very helpful. If you're an instrument pilot, you'll certainly want to incorporate them. If you're not an instrument pilot, then you probably aren't going to bother. So the checklist is the first place to start. The next kind of checklist that I find very useful are the avionics cheat sheets. You've heard me talk about those before. Here's an example of my transponder and audio panel. And as most of you know, some of these audio panels can be fairly complicated, and you want to remember which knob does what and how they work. And in my autopilot, I have a couple of modes that I don't often use, but it's useful sometimes to reference them. I also have a JPI in my airplane, which has a whole bunch of functionality that is not always used, and sometimes I need to refer to that if I want to do something unusual. Regulations are another important area. On the right on this chart, you see a VFR minimum list. It's just a succinct listing of VFR minimums, and over the years, they've gotten a lot more complicated. When I was learning to fly, it was simply 1003 was VFR, and that was the end of that. And you can see from this page that I have here that today VFR minimums are fairly complicated, and there's a lot of different situations. And so most people aren't going to memorize all of these, and it's an area that you often need to refresh your memory on. Another one that I think is very useful is my airplane operating data. Lots of things you can put in here. On the left, you see a listing of the critical speeds for my Mooney. It's all in one place. It's very handy to reference that. On the right, I have my Mooney weight and balance, which has my specific airplane's weight and moment. And I keep that in my book, and often the book is with me when I'm in my hotel room, and perhaps I want to pre-flight or prepare for tomorrow's flight. Well, this next one shows some regulations. And notice that this is a handwritten page. One day I needed to review some requirements. I don't remember what it was for, and so I went through the FARs and I picked up a bunch of data that I wanted to remember, and I had a 5x7 card, I think, and I just wrote it out and thinking, well, I'll go back and make a nice clean copy of that, and, well, life got in the way and never got around to it. So these don't have to be really fancy things made up on your computer. They can be in any format you want. Local procedures, on the left you see my local SFRA frequencies, again very helpful. On the right are some instructional procedures. This particular one has to do with the requirements for the instrument proficiency check and the endorsement that I would be giving after that check. It's one of those things that I need to remind myself of. And finally, I keep a copy of my flight checklists on my kneeboard. And I also keep a second copy in my How to Fly an Airplane book. So I don't carry the whole How to Fly an Airplane book on my kneeboard, and that's just a matter of personal preferences. Well, I hope that you've found some value in this video and that it was worth your time to watch. Just to make a few points to conclude this, don't kid yourself. Creating these pages is not easy. It really does take some time. It takes a lot of thinking, which is part of the value in it, particularly for students. Starting a new training program or an aircraft transition is also another good time to go ahead and codify the things that you're learning and put them in a nice, clean, succinct form and keep them for reference. It's important to keep the content as succinct as possible. It's pretty easy to just get wordy and put a lot of junk in there and copy things directly from various source material, but that's not going to do you very much good if you are trying to get a quick answer. Any logical format can work. Again, I emphasize that these things should be personalized. That's the whole value of these, is that they're personalized to your particular situation and the way you like to remember things. So lastly, I encourage you to talk to your friends or people in your flying school and share your pages. And so with that, have a good day and good flying.